For 7 long minutes, the palace gates remained still, frozen in time. The world watched in silence, holding its breath as Princess Catherine stepped forward, not as the Duchess, not as the flawless royal figure the world had come to know, but as a trembling mother prepared to shatter centuries of royal silence. Her words, raw and unfiltered, would soon send shockwaves through the monarchy and bring even Prince William to his knees. The stillness before she spoke felt like history pausing. Before diving deeper into what this means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Outside Kensington Palace, the air carried an unease unlike anything seen at a royal event before. Journalists, who had been camped outside for days, sensed something extraordinary was about to happen. The hum of cameras faded as Catherine appeared, not from the balcony where she was usually framed in grace and poise, but through the main gates, alone, without a smile or escort. Her posture was fragile yet unyielding, each step weighed down by the burden she carried. Courtiers whispered in confusion, unsure whether to intervene, but by the time they moved, she was already before the microphones. There was no royal emblem behind her, no polished backdrop, only the cold stone walls of Kensington and the raw truth in her eyes. Her trembling hands betrayed a deep conflict raging within her, torn between loyalty and love, between duty and truth. As she lifted her gaze to meet the cameras, time seemed to stop. This was not ceremony, it was rebellion born of heartbreak. The media, veterans of royal spectacle, instantly knew this moment was different, more dangerous. Catherine wasn't speaking as a royal consort, but as a mother pushed beyond her limit. Behind her, the nursery windows stood as silent witnesses. For years they had framed the joyful smiles of George, Charlotte, and Louis, the perfect royal image. But now they seemed to look down in sorrow, mirroring their mother's defiance. Catherine's eyes flickered toward them, her lips tightening as she seemed to draw strength from memories of her children's laughter. The tension in the air was electric. No one knew what she would say, but everyone sensed that her words would change everything. Royal aides exchanged anxious glances. The usual sense of order, carefully rehearsed statements, polished decorum, diplomatic restraint, was gone. In its place stood a woman determined to speak her truth. The reporters nearest to her could see the shimmer in her eyes, not of weakness, but of fierce resolve. Every passing second of silence stretched endlessly, thick with the knowledge that history was about to shift. Catherine drew in a trembling breath, her lungs heavy with centuries of expectation. The murmurs outside the palace faded into complete silence. Even the clicking of cameras felt sacrilegious. She was no longer a figure confined by the crown's narrative. In that moment, she became every mother who had ever fought to protect her child from forces beyond her control. The crowd waited as her lips parted. The monarchy, centuries old, powerful, untouchable, held its breath. Yet no one, not even those inside the palace walls, could have predicted the gravity of the words about to be spoken, or the tragedy that would turn royal duty into personal heartbreak. When Catherine finally spoke, her voice trembled like a storm on the verge of breaking. She wasn't reading from notes or following a script. Every word came from the heart of a mother pushed too far. The palace had trained her to smile through anything, but not this time. Her words tore away the gilded facade, revealing the painful truth about the price her children had paid for their birthright. The silence that followed her first sentence was unlike anything the palace had ever experienced. For years, Catherine had embodied grace, calm, and quiet endurance. She bore the weight of the crown while shielding her family from constant scrutiny. But that silence came at a cost, and now it poured out of her with every syllable. Her voice was steady yet charged, quivering only when emotion pierced through royal restraint. She wasn't addressing the media, nor was she speaking for the monarchy. She was speaking to the people, to parents who knew that no privilege could shield a family from pain. She confessed that her silence had become suffocating, that every carefully worded statement written by palace aides had felt like a betrayal of her children's truth. "My silence," she said softly, "was killing me more than any scandal could." Her words sent a ripple through the crowd, an audible gasp as people realized this wasn't a staged appearance. It was an emotional reckoning. For the first time, the world saw the pain behind her composure, the voice of a woman no longer willing to let her children pay the price for a royal image. Her confession deepened as she spoke of George, Charlotte, and Louis, not as heirs to the throne, but as children burdened by expectations they never asked for. Behind the balcony smiles were moments of exhaustion, confusion, and tears. She revealed how their laughter had grown quieter, how the crown's expectations had begun to dim their innocence. "They are children," she said, "and yet they live every day under the shadow of who they're meant to become." Each word cut deep, a reminder that royal titles may shine, but they demand a painful sacrifice. Her tone darkened as she condemned the monarchy's obsession with perfection, how it had turned her family into a spectacle. Every act of affection was dissected, every stumble magnified, every glance misinterpreted. Her children's lives had become headlines, their childhoods written not by them, but by a relentless, intrusive public. It was a chilling condemnation, not just of the press, but of the institution itself, which had allowed and even encouraged this invasion of privacy to maintain the illusion of royal mystique. Catherine paused, her breath quivering as she summoned the courage to say what no royal had ever dared. "No crown," she said firmly, her voice now strong and resolute, "is worth a child's peace of mind." The words hit like thunder. It wasn't merely a statement. It was a bold declaration of rebellion against centuries of monarchy that had always placed duty above humanity. The audience fell silent, many too shocked to move, others holding back tears. Catherine's defiance shattered the illusion separating royalty from reality. For the first time, the people didn't see a princess wrapped in privilege. They saw a mother standing alone against an empire built on silence. The tremor in her voice became a tremor within the monarchy itself, and the echoes of her confession were about to reach the very heart of power. For years, the public had imagined the royal nursery as a fairy tale filled with laughter, games, and innocent joy hidden behind castle walls. But Catherine's revelation tore that fantasy apart. What she described wasn't a dream. It was a gilded cage. The smiles were staged, the moments rehearsed, and behind every perfect photograph hid a child's unseen tear. No one had ever dared to show the truth. In an instant, the illusion was destroyed, replaced by a painful reality. What Catherine revealed next was even darker than anyone could have anticipated. Behind the towering walls of Kensington and Windsor, where the public saw cheerful children waving from balconies, a very different reality existed. The royal nursery, once portrayed as a haven of happiness, had become a place of quiet suffocation. Every hour of George, Charlotte, and Louis's lives was meticulously planned, from their studies to their walks, from the words they spoke to the smiles they were ordered to wear. Tutors came and went with mechanical precision, each sworn to secrecy and each reinforcing the same lesson: duty must always come before emotion. There were no lazy mornings, no bursts of spontaneous laughter, no carefree days like other children enjoyed. Instead, there was order, obedience, and an unspoken understanding that innocence had an expiration date. As the eldest, George carried the heaviest burden. Catherine's voice trembled as she spoke about how he had begun to understand what it truly meant to be the future king. Once curious and full of wonder, he had grown quiet and wary. He started asking questions no child should have to voice. What if he didn't want to be king, or what if he made a mistake? Every time, aides responded with gentle but firm reminders that destiny was not a choice. Catherine said she could see the weight on her son's shoulders, invisible to everyone else. His laughter, once so effortless, had become rare, replaced by a silence only a mother could recognize as fear. Then there was Louis, still so young, still innocent enough to believe the world outside the palace walls was kind. But even he was not spared the constant scrutiny. Catherine revealed that her youngest had begun to freeze whenever cameras appeared, confused by the shouting strangers who called his name and dissected his every move. He couldn't understand that his childhood had become public property. The flashes of cameras, meant to celebrate him, felt instead like warnings that nothing he did truly belonged to him. Catherine's guilt became unbearable as she described watching the light fade from her children's eyes. She had been powerless, trapped in a system that valued perfection more than peace. She remembered the day their laughter stopped echoing through the halls, a silence that haunted her, louder than any scream could be. She admitted she had tried to convince herself it was temporary, that it was just part of growing up royal. But deep down, she knew it was something darker, something cold and intentional. Her words hung in the air, leaving the audience breathless. In a whisper, Catherine suggested that what she had discovered went far deeper than anyone could imagine. Behind the polite smiles and polished speeches were training methods disguised as royal preparation, methods that stripped her children of the very thing she was trying to protect, their innocence. The room held its breath. This was no longer about duty or discomfort. It was about survival. When Catherine uncovered what had been done in the name of royal preparation, her heartbreak turned into fury, and the monarchy's darkest secret began to unravel. As she described what her children endured behind closed doors, even the most hardened royal correspondents froze. Her words hinted at manipulation not from outsiders, but from those within the palace itself, advisors, image consultants, and even senior royals, all complicit in shaping children into obedient symbols of the crown. What Catherine revealed wasn't just personal pain. It exposed a machine that had fed on innocence for generations. As she continued, Catherine's voice grew steadier, sharper. She described a system so rigidly ingrained in palace life that even love was measured, rationed, and recorded like an official act of state. Every moment of her children's lives was dictated by a royal schedule. Endless lessons, etiquette rehearsals, and carefully controlled outings that left no room for joy or spontaneity. Tutors and advisors acted as watchmen, ensuring every smile, every word, every gesture matched the image of perfection demanded by the monarchy. Childhood, she said, wasn't something her children were allowed to live. It was something they were forced to perform. Her voice faltered briefly when she admitted that even her own affection for her children sometimes felt monitored, as though showing warmth violated royal decorum. The most chilling part of her confession came when she described what she called emotional conditioning, an unwritten rule passed down through generations of royals: never show fear, never cry, never falter. Her children, she said, were being trained to suppress emotion in the name of composure, to replace natural feeling with calculated poise. They were told that vulnerability was weakness, that the world expected them to appear unshaken even when their hearts trembled. "They're being trained," she whispered, "not to feel but to perform." Those listening outside the palace began to grasp the magnitude of what she was revealing. This wasn't about tradition, it was about control. Then came the revelation that sent shockwaves through the room. Catherine claimed that palace advisors had crossed lines, exerting influence far beyond their roles. They dictated even the smallest details of her children's lives, when they could play, how they could behave, and even when she, their own mother, was allowed to spend time with them. Her anger finally broke through the calm exterior she had tried to maintain as she revealed that she had been advised to teach her children independence by keeping a distance from them, a method that echoed the emotional detachment once imposed on royal children of the past. Her voice trembled, filled with strength and heartbreak as she said, "A mother should never be told that love can be harmful." The pain in her words deepened when she admitted that even William, loving and devoted as he was, had been trapped in the same cycle. Guided by advisors who urged him to maintain discipline and distance, he too had become part of the system that had once left scars on him as a boy. Catherine's tone grew soft and sorrowful as she described how the same institution that shaped his childhood was now trying to shape theirs, and how, without realizing it, history was beginning to repeat itself. "He loves them," she said quietly, "but he's been taught to love them from afar." The audience could feel the weight of those words, the realization that the royal crown demanded not just loyalty, but separation. Her speech grew darker as she spoke of the monarchy's obsession with control, explaining that this flaw was not limited to her own family, but embedded deep within its very structure. For centuries, the institution had survived by turning emotion into performance and authenticity into ritual. Catherine suggested that each generation inherited not only privilege, but also trauma disguised as duty. It was a constant cycle of sacrifice, where affection was traded for image, and individuality was the first thing lost to the crown. She paused, her gaze unwavering, as if addressing those unseen figures who built that legacy, and said firmly, "This isn't preparation for leadership. It's the quiet destruction of childhood." The words hung heavy in the air. No one dared move. In that moment, the monarchy, so often seen as powerful and unshakable, suddenly looked fragile. Like a fortress built on pain it refused to acknowledge. When Catherine spoke again, her voice softened, but what she said next sent chills through everyone listening. "This cycle has already taken too many before." Those 4 words, "too many before," cut through history, awakening a ghost the crown had long tried to bury: Diana. Though Catherine never said the name, everyone heard it. The atmosphere shifted from sorrow to something almost prophetic. For a moment, it felt as though the spirit of the people's princess had returned through her daughter-in-law's voice. The same defiance, the same heartbreak, the same fierce love for her children that once shook the foundations of the monarchy were alive again. History, it seemed, was repeating itself, and the palace knew it. No name needed to be spoken. The silence between Catherine's words carried it. The world could feel it. The echo of a woman who had once stood alone against the same institution, bearing the same wounds and fighting the same fight for her children's humanity. Catherine's voice carried that legacy, not borrowed but reborn. Every pause, every tremor, every truth she uttered carried the ghost of Diana's defiance. The monarchy, which had spent decades trying to bury the past, suddenly found itself haunted by it. This was not just Catherine speaking. It was history repeating itself, heartbeat by heartbeat. Across the nation, hearts clenched in recognition. Those who remembered Diana's 1995 interview could hear the same rhythm of rebellion in Catherine's tone. It was that quiet refusal. For decades, the royal family had tried to rewrite Diana's story, turning rebellion into redemption, tragedy into myth. But now, that myth had come alive again through Catherine, breathing new life into the same defiance they had once silenced. William's composure began to unravel quietly, hidden from public eyes but impossible to hide within palace walls. Those who saw him said his gaze was distant, as though he were watching 2 timelines collide, one where he was a boy holding his mother's hand, and another where he was a man watching history repeat through his wife. It was no longer just a resemblance, it was a warning. Catherine's courage had unearthed a truth he had long tried to suppress, that the monarchy's silence had destroyed his mother and now threatened his family once more. And as the world celebrated Catherine's bravery, behind the palace walls, her husband, the future king, was quietly breaking under the unbearable weight of history repeating itself. Behind every royal photograph lies a hidden war, and for Prince William, that war had finally reached its breaking point. As Catherine's words echoed in his mind, he felt both pride and devastation, pride in her courage and devastation in the truth it forced him to confront. The man who had been raised to serve the crown now stood torn between 2 oaths, one to his duty and one to his heart. One loyalty tied him to the monarchy that had shaped his entire existence, and another bound him to the family that gave his life meaning. Inside the palace, time appeared frozen. Catherine's words still echoed through the marble corridors, faint yet piercing, like the toll of a distant bell. William sat alone before a television, watching her announcement on repeat. Each replay cut deeper, leaving invisible wounds on his conscience. The woman he loved had just done what no royal had dared to do since his mother. She had spoken the truth openly, without filters or fear. Her courage filled him with awe, yet it also shattered the delicate balance he had been struggling to keep between his duties as heir and his heart as a husband. He could feel her pain, hear the tremor in her voice, and sense the burden of words she had held back for far too long. But beneath his admiration was a growing fear that history was beginning to repeat itself and that he was powerless to stop it. the palace erupted into chaos. Advisors filled the halls, their voices sharp, their faces pale with panic. They urged William to issue a counterstatement immediately, a carefully crafted message to regain control and protect the crown's image. Every suggestion they made dripped with diplomacy, yet was steeped in denial. They wanted him to dismiss Catherine's words, to distance himself from her, to preserve the monarchy's image before the truth spread too far. But William couldn't bring himself to do it. Every time he tried to speak, he heard his mother's voice whispering through memory. Never sacrifice truth for duty. It will cost you everything. His silence enraged the courtiers. One advisor muttered that his hesitation was treason through stillness. Another warned that by refusing to act, he was letting the monarchy bleed. But William knew that denouncing Catherine would mean betraying something sacred, his own soul. The weight of the crown pressed heavier than ever. Behind closed doors, William's mind spiraled through memories he had long buried. He saw his mother's tear-streaked face, begging to protect her sons from the institution that had broken her spirit. He heard the cold, rehearsed voices of advisors telling her to smile for the cameras. He remembered the loneliness that followed, the way she had been left to pay the price for her honesty. And now Catherine was standing in that same space, brave, exposed, and defiant, while he was expected to silence her. The realization crushed him. In the solitude of his quarters, his composure finally crumbled. The tears came softly at first, then uncontrollably, as years of suppressed grief flooded out. He wasn't crying for Catherine or even the crown. He was crying for the boy he once was, the one who had watched his mother's light fade within these same unforgiving walls, pressing his hands against his face. He trembled beneath the weight of a legacy he had never wanted. The crown had taken his mother's peace, and now it threatened to take his family's too. In that moment, he understood the true cost of loyalty, the price every royal must pay when duty demands the sacrifice of love. When the storm of emotion passed, clarity settled in. William made a vow, not to the crown, nor to tradition, but to his children. He promised that George, Charlotte, and Louis would never suffer the same pain he had. "Whatever it takes," he whispered into the empty room, "I'll protect them." It was not the promise of a prince, but the oath of a father standing on the edge of breaking. That choice would change everything. Once such a vow was made, there could be no turning back. But William's decision would spark a battle unlike any other, not between husband and wife, but between the future king and the reigning one. When the king heard Catherine's words, the atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace turned cold. Charles saw her act not as a plea from a mother, but as a rebellion that threatened his authority. Camilla's fury burned even hotter. To her, Catherine's heartfelt confession was not courage, it was betrayal. And in that moment, the monarchy's greatest enemy was not the press or the public, but one of their own. The palace, once bound by silence as its greatest weapon, now trembled with unrest. Behind closed doors, the calm mask Charles wore for decades began to crack. The king, who had endured scandal and scrutiny for most of his life, now faced something far more dangerous, the truth spoken from within. Catherine's defiance, though delivered with grace, had pierced the heart of the institution. It wasn't just what she had said, it was that she had said it publicly, freely, and unapologetically. To Charles, her actions were insubordination disguised as sincerity. To Camilla, it was an act of war. Within an hour of Catherine's announcement, an emergency meeting was called. Senior advisors gathered under the weight of royal panic. The king's voice, cold and sharp, cut through the air as he demanded answers. "How could this happen?" he asked, not in confusion but in disbelief. The room fell silent. No one met his eyes. They spoke of containment, damage control, and narrative management. Suggestions came fast and ruthless. Restrict Catherine's appearances, remove her from public duties, issue a statement to reclaim authority. But Charles wanted more than control. He wanted silence. "She will not speak again," he ordered. And with that, a plan began to take shape. One that would test the loyalty of every person in the room. Camilla's rage, however, ran deeper. To her, Catherine's act was not emotional, it was calculated. "She's using motherhood as a weapon," she hissed, convinced Catherine was manipulating sympathy to turn the public against them. Her resentment was sharpened by fear, the fear that Catherine's popularity had already eclipsed her own. Camilla had fought for years to be accepted, to earn her crown despite the scandal and suspicion. But in a single moment, Catherine's vulnerability had undone that work. To the world, Catherine was no longer just a princess. She was a mother under siege, a woman standing against a machine. And that made her untouchable. Before long, whispers of something darker began to spread. Anonymous palace sources claimed Catherine was unstable, overwhelmed, and unfit for her role. It was a familiar script, one used against Diana decades earlier, revived and repackaged for a new generation. But this time the world was watching closely. Every attempt to discredit Catherine only strengthened the wave of sympathy around her. She had become the voice of humanity in a house built on silence, and no smear could erase that. Then came the confrontation the palace feared most, father and son. William stormed into his father's study, his restraint gone, his composure shattered. He pleaded for understanding, insisting Catherine's words came not from rebellion, but desperation. "She's protecting our children," he said, voice trembling. But Charles, hardened by duty, refused to bend. "She's endangering the crown," he replied coldly. The argument escalated until words turned to wounds that could never be taken back. Camilla tried to calm them, but William's fury only grew. "If you silence her," he warned, "you lose me too." It wasn't a threat. It was a prophecy. The heir had chosen his heart over heritage. That night, the palace fell silent again, but the quiet was deceptive. Cracks had begun to spread within its walls, faster than any advisor could contain. And while tempers flared behind closed doors, a storm had already erupted outside. This time, it wasn't just the media watching, it was the entire world. From London to Los Angeles, Catherine's words sparked a movement. What began as a royal scandal transformed into something greater, a global call for compassion over tradition. Parents and children filled the streets, holding signs, chanting her name. The monarchy had survived wars, scandals, and divorces, but never this. This was a rebellion born not from anger, but from empathy. And as the crowds grew, one truth stood out above all. The world had finally stopped bowing and started to feel. Catherine had become more than just a princess. She had become a voice that echoed across the world. The impact of her confession spread with a force that no royal advisor could contain. Overnight, her words transcended borders, languages, and generations. Social media erupted in a storm of solidarity that shook the establishment to its core. Hashtags like #Stand with Catherine and Protect the Children shot to the top of global trends. Within hours, millions shared her speech, labeling it not as a royal address, but as a declaration of humanity. Her voice, trembling yet sincere and fearless, resonated in every corner of the planet. It was no longer about royalty. It was about motherhood, truth, and the fight to preserve innocence. Across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, crowds gathered outside embassies and royal landmarks. Candlelight vigils replaced royal ceremonies, and placards read, "Let them be children. Love over legacy. No crown without compassion." What began as a single speech evolved into a revolution of empathy. Families who had never cared for royal drama suddenly found themselves deeply moved by a cause that went beyond the palace walls. Catherine's courage gave voice to the voiceless, to parents who had watched their children crumble under expectations, and to every person who had ever been silenced by power. The global media quickly shifted its tone. What had been dismissed as an emotional outburst was now celebrated as a defining act of modern courage. Headlines praised her bravery, calling her the mother who spoke against the crown. Even the most loyal royal publications began to change their tune, describing her speech as a wake-up call for an outdated institution. World leaders quietly admired her honesty. Some publicly called for a new kind of leadership, one that values compassion over protocol. Others were more cautious, suggesting that the monarchy's silence was no longer a sign of dignity, but of guilt. The royal family's refusal to respond only fueled public suspicion. Each day of silence made the fire burn brighter, and what once seemed like strategy now looked like confession. Memes, op-eds, and viral videos began dissecting every glance and every unspoken word from the palace. The story no longer belonged to the royals. It belonged to the people, and the people had chosen Catherine. Her image appeared on banners, murals, and magazine covers. She was no longer the Duchess of Cambridge or the future queen consort. She had become a symbol of truth over tradition and heart over hierarchy. Even those who had once dismissed her as a reserved royal now saw her as the woman who dared to reveal what no one else would. Her defiance awakened a powerful truth, that monarchy without humanity was nothing more than illusion. Yet amidst all the admiration and the global uproar, Catherine remained silent, not defeated, but intentional. Those close to her said she was preparing for something greater, something final. While the world celebrated her courage, she knew the battle was far from over. The palace's silence was not surrender. Tension grew, and Catherine was ready to face it. When the noise reached its peak, she returned to the podium, not to apologize, but to stand firm in defiance with one final historic promise. Her final appearance was not scripted or approved. It was an act of grace wrapped in defiance. Standing before the same gates where it had all begun, Catherine made a vow that silenced the world, a promise no royal had ever dared to make. With steady eyes and a trembling heart, she declared that her children would never again be sacrificed to the machinery of tradition. The monarchy would either bend or break. The atmosphere that day was electric. People gathered not for a royal ceremony, but for transformation. Catherine, once the symbol of royal composure, had become a force of change. Her voice carried the weight of centuries, yet it trembled with something far stronger than tradition: love. She spoke of her children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, not as heirs but as human beings. They deserve to laugh without fear, she said softly, to grow without expectation, and to live without the shadow of duty. Her words were unpolished, raw, and absolute. The grandeur of the monarchy suddenly felt small next to the power of a mother's conviction. Then came the vow that shook royal history. Catherine announced that her children would be withdrawn from public royal duties indefinitely. No more staged photographs, balcony appearances, or parading innocence before the cameras. Their childhood, she declared, will no longer be a performance for the world to consume. In that single moment, Catherine did what no royal had ever done. She broke the contract between the crown and the public eye. The monarchy's image, long sustained by the visibility of its heirs, was stripped of its next generation. For the first time in living memory, the royal line stepped away from spectacle. The world reacted instantly. Some watched in awe, others in disbelief. Social media flooded with both praise and outrage. To some, she was the hero the monarchy needed, the woman who dared to humanize royalty. To others, she was a threat to the institution itself. But whether they adored or condemned her, no one could ignore the monumental shift her words created. This wasn't evolution. It was revolution from within. Inside the palace, silence loomed. King Charles did not appear, speak, or release a statement. His silence became its own message, a reflection of fractures within the royal family. Rumors spread that his anger had reached a breaking point and that his belief in unity had shattered. Queen Camilla's influence was questioned as her composure faltered under the weight of Catherine's growing public sainthood. Advisors scrambled to contain the damage, but no official statement could match the authenticity of what the world had already witnessed. Then, in a moment that felt destined, William stood beside his wife. For days, he had been torn between loyalty to the crown and loyalty to his conscience. But as Catherine finished her vow, he stepped forward, tears welling in his eyes. In that moment, the world saw not a prince, but a man, a husband, father, and son, reliving his mother's tragedy, but rewriting its ending. His tears spoke louder than any royal decree. It was the breaking point the monarchy had feared, the beginning of something they could no longer control. Catherine's declaration was more than rebellion. It was redemption. Redemption for Diana, for William, and for all the generations of children raised beneath golden ceilings but deprived of freedom. She had lifted the weight of royal history and exposed the humanity buried beneath. The monarchy, once a fortress of silence, was finally forced to confront an undeniable truth: that love is the only crown that can never be taken away. And, as the palace lights dimmed that night, one truth lingered in the air. Love had triumphed over legacy, and history would forever remember the day Catherine chose her children over the crown. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next.